Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm a little shy, so I prepared written notes in response to Professor Choi's book, which you should all read. So that's the most important thing that I'll say today. So A Post-Colonial Relationship, that's the title of the book, is a book that enters the very tense debate about racial relations in the context of the United States. So easy topic. It does so with the support of post-colonial theory and from the perspective of Asian immigrant communities. So that is to say, this is a book that talks about race by adopting a very different point of departure and the more typical analysis of racial relations in the United States. Dr. Choi is concerned that the discussion on race in this country has tended towards two binaries. The white-black binary on the one hand, and on the other hand, the native-alien binary. So the first part of the book addresses those two binaries. In Dr. Choi's words, and I quote here, the main focus of this book is to dismantle binary relational divides that support white privilege and colonial and post-colonial domination, and to provide a deeper understanding of Asian racial relations, end of quote. According to Dr. Choi, in the context of these binary oppositions, and here's another quote, Asian immigrants occupy the position of a double in-betweenness. Okay, so that's an important concept in this book, a double in-betweenness. The book is timely as it addresses rising anti-Asian violence in this country and names it as a fruit of racism. This is not just a matter of immigration policies, it is a question of racism. It is also timely as it presents a mode of thinking about race and racism in complex and nuanced ways. So my first word is really of appreciation for Dr. Choi for writing this book and for sharing it with us. My response includes three issues that I think were made possible for me as I was engaging this book. The first is a comment of really appreciation and gratitude for this project and about the importance of this category of the third other. It's another important concept in this book, and it's a concept that is unpacked in several portions of the book. I see this as a major sign of the contribution that post-colonial theory can offer in the direction of more just relations, racial and otherwise. Dr. Choi helpfully points out that binaries are not as stable as they represent themselves to be. I'll repeat that. Binaries are not as stable as they represent themselves to be. Though they are presented as somehow co-eternal, natural, biological, you name it, binaries are constructed, and in their construction they also inadvertently engender some remainders, some residues, some surplus categories that demonstrate the instability of the binary. In Dr. Choi's book, this is where Asian immigrants appear as the third other in the racial discourse in the United States. In the quite moving final pages of the book, she states, and I quote, "A post-colonial relationship is not just a non-binary relationship in opposition to a binary relationship. Being the third other is produced from binary relations." You see the instability of the binary producing something that it does not want to produce. So being the third other is produced from binary relations, but their third otherness is not recognized in these binary relations because binary relations do not allow the existence of being of the third other as they emphasize the existence of binaries only. And that's a quote from page 133. This attention to the third is present and reminds me of Omibaba's concept of the third space, which he elaborated in his famous book, The Location of Culture, a very important book for the formation of post-colonial theory. It also resonates with the concept of hybridity that is present in Omibaba. That is to say, this book, A Post-Colonial Relationship, suggests, alongside other post-colonial theories and theologies, that whatever binary is set up to police as a binary structure cannot be contained in said structure. The grave pain experienced by Asian immigrant communities in the US is a result of this binary structure, which has no space for them. The promise of a post-colonial relationship from the perspective of Asian communities is the gift of escaping this stifling binary structure. The result is more life-giving cross-racial and cross-cultural relationships. So that was the first point. It's really a word of gratitude. The second question relates to the category of class and its impact on the discussion about race. There's an important discussion that Dr. Choi stages in this book about the category of white trash. You've heard this, right? It reminded me of Nancy Eisenberg's book, White Trash, in which she demonstrates how the formation of this category had everything to do with both class and race. White trash was a way of saying that a person or a community does not rise to the level of whiteness because of their poverty. Their class status makes them unwhite. That in itself poses the interesting challenge to any idea about the stability of racial categories, or racial essentialism. In my view, Dr. Choi makes the point quite forcefully in the book. It comes in the context of her critique of white liberals who seem to think of themselves beyond the structures of white supremacy and who scapegoat white trash for the racism that endures in American society. The point is really well taken. And again, when you read the book, you will see the power of that argument. What I'm less certain about is the connection that this book traces between white trash and white liberal middle class groups, who Dr. Choi suggests dumped white colonial sinfulness on white poor working class groups. So I'm interested in hearing more about what makes these white groups a part of the so-called middle class. It appears to me that post-colonial relationship places the blame for the creation of racial economic categories of white trash on the white middle class. So I would like to ask, would the category of a dominant class be perhaps more helpful in here, or maybe the ruling class? Or more directly to my point and perhaps my own bias in here, why not call it the capitalist class? That is, in the context of colonial power and capitalist exploitation, these are contexts that Dr. Choi highlights in the book. What makes one a member of a middle class? What are they in the middle of? And what ideological forces might push them to think of themselves, that is the middle class? What forces push them to think of themselves as somehow dominant? I place these questions because of a concern that I have that the language of a middle class might buy into the folklore that the United States is somehow a middle class society, a legend that tends to obscure the working class and the exploitation we suffer under the dominant economic forces. So in this context, I have often seen people who are squarely in the working class. That is, they depend on wages for their survival and subsistence. That makes one working class. You need wages to survive. So I've seen people in the working class claim to be in the middle. From an intersectional perspective, the lack of class awareness expands and deepens the force of white supremacy. So in the project of decolonizing racial relations, it seems to me that thinking about class is quite important. Dr. Choi does that at several points in the book, but my concern is around the reference to the middle class. So that was my second point. The third and final one is by way of conclusion, I want to ask a broader question about the experience of migration as is narrated beautifully in this book. I wonder if Dr. Choi could also speak to what cross-cultural experiences and transnational coalitions might do to one's sense of racial identity. Right, so what happens to one's sense of identity and racial belonging after migration, in the process of migration? So the book describes in detail the struggles that migrants entering the United States experience when they are perceived and described as Asian. Dr. Choi is clear that this marker was not relevant or meaningful for immigrant communities. It was sort of imposed in the process of migration. I resonate deeply with that, and at the same time, there's something important about the force that these communities have in destabilizing racist discourse because, and not despite, but because of their stories of migration. So also, there's something happens when these communities look back at their countries of origin after the experience of migration. It occurs to me, for example, that some of the most enduring forms of cross-national and cross-cultural coalitions occurred by people in the diaspora. So everyone here in Christianity engage in modernity? This is Pan-Africanism, okay? That's our discussion last week. So I'm intrigued by that. How is it that those cross-cultural, cross-national coalitions occurred by people who were in the diaspora? I always think about how my own sense of belonging and identity as a Latin American has been deepened, challenged, reaffirmed, and expanded because of the various interactions that I'm able to have in the United States with various Latinx communities. Communities that I did not interact with directly while living in my home country in Brazil. So this is not an experience of homogeneity, which the book seeks to avoid, but one of the possibility of coalitions and cultural interchange. So this final question is the one that I posed to Dr. Choi in closing. I wanted to ask if this is an experience that resonates, and or if you believe that this is a true form or a possible form of post-colonial relationship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Filipe, for doing an excellent job of summarizing the book and pulling out some of its key points. And I resonate with a lot of what you said. I was struck again when I was reading this book by the role of conceptual binaries and how they construct and legitimate power. And so I want to play with the idea of conceptual binaries and also interrogate a third conceptual binary that I think is implicit in the book, which is that between the spiritual and the economic. So as Dr. Choi describes, certain binaries are essential to the creation and the recreation of the colonial order, especially the black-white binary and the native-alien binary. Not only do such binaries exist in socially and historically contingent notions of what is common sense, but they have moral power in the sense that they rely on and reinforce the normative evaluations that pervade our lives. So that is to say, the kinds of virtues we take as virtues within our society are also implicitly tied to the conceptual binaries we use to categorize and control human bodies. Hardworking versus lazy, intelligent versus unintelligent, and so on. These are the near unspeakable undercurrents of the categories we use to group people, even as we attempt, through institutional and individual efforts at purgation, to retain these categories of difference as obvious, race as an obvious category, but make them no longer moral or value-laden or meaningful. I don't see race. For people's life chances, opportunities, and relationships, right? So there's that, we still carry these categories and use them on, everything from censuses to institutional efforts at DEI, and we take the categories even as we try to purge them of these value-laden binaries, but they carry them in all kinds of ways. So as pervasive as these binaries are, and as much power as they exert over our lives, there is nothing natural or universal about them. And I think that's a big part of Dr. Choi's work. We don't have to take them as obvious or universal. It made me think a lot about the book On the Post-Colony by Achille Mbembe, and how he argues that there's a historic specificity in the way that Western philosophical thought thinks about the other. So I'll quote from that. He says that the problem of the I, or the selfhood of others, and of the human beings we perceive as being foreign to us, has almost always posed virtually insurmountable difficulties to the Western philosophical and political tradition. So in other words, the philosophies and the politics that emerged along with economic colonialism do not give us the tools we need to engage in a post-colonial relationship that does not devalue the selfhood of the other. This is part of why these binaries are so sticky. They build on deep philosophical and even spiritual foundations. So this, to my mind, brings up a third binary, which is probably even less interrogated, I think, in the academy, and I'll explain why I think that is, which is that between human economy and human spirituality. As Dr. Choi's work is situated between fields, so as practical theology sort of inherently interdisciplinary, it allows her to talk about colonialism as an economic and political and moral spiritual system in ways that are truly rare. So I say, coming to this as a social scientist, the political economy of colonialism and post-colonialism is arguably the thing we talk about the most, right? It's arguably the field unifying object of study. There's all kinds of analyses about the economics and the politics of capitalism and colonial capitalism specifically. But works about colonialism as a spiritual project are almost non-existent. If anything, the inquiry ends at analyzing Christian institutions and evangelism as scaffolding of colonial power, but ultimately as a secondary or epiphenomenal process. By the same token, so punchline, sociologists, economists who study class systems, the economics of capitalism, of colonialism, have all kinds of things to say about that, but very little to say about the spiritual and the moral dynamics of it. But by the same token, I often worry that those concerned with human spirituality treat it too often as a non-economic or even anti-economic affair, so something that's separate from the category of economics, which can ultimately insulate our ideas about spirituality from post-colonial critique. I could say a lot more about how I think this binary works. I think it's encoded in our institutions, but at the very least, it's encoded in how we arrange academic disciplines, right? The people who study spirituality and morality as opposed to the people who study economics. Not often the same people. Not often the same units of the university, right? But I will just point out here that for our benefit, there is a lot of social and economic theory that is full of resources on the racial and economic order and how it perpetually reinvents itself in our institutions. And I do encourage all of us to dive deeper into that literature for more tools. For example, the work by Matthew Desmond on the racial order comes at it from a slightly different perspective, but again, the idea of the racial order is to push against these kinds of black-white, native-alien binaries and think about how different groups throughout U.S. history have had to contend with whiteness as a set of ideals, as a set of moral ideals that's also reflected in economic inequity. I did wonder, connected to that, if Dr. Choi had a particular way of understanding the difference between post-coloniality and decoloniality, where the way that I've often read decolonial logic is that it points to a particular counter-hegemonic way of being and knowing in the academy. So my question is simply, do these categories do similar work in your view? Are they some ways opposed or different? But that said, I'll just end by restating something that came through very powerfully in reading this book, which is that working against racism and nativism is a much bigger project than simply purging ourselves and our institutions of inequity and discrimination. It has to involve a deep moral examination, where we hold up our deepest notions of value to scrutiny, even if they seem on the face of it to have nothing to do with race or culture or power, because often we'll find that they do. And replace the binary categories with openness and curiosity about those with whom we share space. So one word that kept coming to mind as almost an antidote of this binary thinking is a curiosity, right? Is an attitude of curiosity as opposed to categorical certainty. And I think that spirit very much pervaded this book. So thank you so much.
When actually Dean Park suggested to have a book discussion, and in my mind, no, don't do that. Especially here at BU, no, that's not a good idea. Because when I also heard that this book will be reviewed by Dr. Maia and also Dr. Manglos-Weber, I thought, okay, constructive theologian. And then also, church and society professor. I'm not sure how they are going to read my book because it's neither, the constructive theology nor not so perfectly fit into the community and society, even though it partially fit to both areas. Because what I do is so-called interdisciplinary, which means in academia nothing. It does not belong to any places, areas. So I was super nervous. So what does he have to say, and what does she has to say to me? And hearing this whole great analysis, I thought at the beginning, whatever they say, this is right. I should apologize and say, you are right. I think I should do that more. That is very typical of Asian so-called humility. I don't wanna go against people who have different thoughts and different analysis. It's rather just to say, oh, I didn't think about that. That is exactly maybe what I should do, but I didn't do that in this book. So next book project. So there is something that I actually deeply thought about Dr. Maia's the question about what is the middle class to you in this society. And I thought, wow, okay. For me, it was almost like, okay, first of all, the education and Christianity and also economic. These all three like very elite. So their brain is so elite that they cannot agree with many things easily. And that is one of the very features of middle class. They have so very distinctive and great but various ideas that they don't have any monologue or one thinking that everyone agrees. So for me, it's like education. And then economics, of course, they have to be rich. It means they should be paid more than the minimum wage. And that was a very big factor of that. And then also there is this, for me, it's at least, they have to be white. Because white has a lot of power and privilege in this society. So the skin color is super important. But my thought does not stop there. What he's asking me is a really profound question. And in order to answer that, I think I need to actually another book to really argue with the thoughts. What is the non-binary, binary to define the middle class in this society? And what do I mean? I actually agreed with the argument that Shannon, the white trash, the part with that professor. But for me, it's a little bit go further than that, because for me, white always carries with this colonizer's image. And so middle class is not just the middle class. Maybe, to be honest, is middle or the upper elite class who has a privilege to go to travel or go to another country freely with their own will and occupy that place and want to control the space, whatever space that they are in. So that is another image that when I have and think about the white middle class.
Yeah.
And then of course it's I was born and raised in Korea, and the colonial experience that I have is always there. When I look at the so-called American, I always image that it's white American image in my head. So when I think about the middle class, that image automatically comes out and played. And also when the white America to the Korean society was so deeply related with this missionary like walk, how they help us and save us. So that was the image that playing with my white middle class. So that question gave me like a great imagination and thought, and give me another passion to think about how can I make the argument with this definition and how can I define this middle class with what character and features. So thank you for giving me this like provoking idea to play with this and think about the race and also class at the same time with the colonial and post-colonial the power. And also Dr. Manglos-Weber's what is the decolonial and also post-colonial? And that question was not only from her but from our colleague, that how do you define your post-colonialism? And for me, it's not anti-colonialism, it's not decolonialism. For me, it's actually always go both. The colonialism, yes, it produces certain problems in the colonized land and field. But after they are gone, there is, of course, the remnants of the whole colonialism there. But what I really want to raise up here is the power of the people who experience colonialism. And we often just dismiss those power and say, oh, they are the colonizers, period. But for me, yes, they are the colonizers, but they are the ones who struggle and fight against this colonialism, and by their power, they finally earn and also have this independence and freedom. So when I think about the post-colonial world, their power should not be eliminated or forget. It has to be remembered and also reinterpret what kind of struggle and power and also labors that they have to be independent again. Not just to say that the white first world saved their country and give them the freedom. I refuse to think that. How many blood and the tears they shed in that place bring the peace again and harmony and also justice. So when I think about the post-colonialism, I always think about two parts. One is the social and political, the analysis that I need to bring. But the other hand is what is the power of post-colonialism that people exercise in that place? Not only as ex-colonized, but the people who are already originally by the creation, the power of God, the creation, that we are equally born and exercise our life with peace. So how can I bring that image to this colonized land? Then how the people imitate God's freedom and independence and the justice to the world. So that is always coming together, how the people actually change the world in this colonial society, how they bring the peace to this post-colonial world even right now, and how these colonizers play with these social constructions. So how these actually crush it together and make another space to change this world now. So that is my way to approach the post-colonialism always. Anyway, when I write this book for the first time in a first draft, of course, the first reader is my husband, and I ask him to read and just tell him, please be honest. You can tell me anything. I want to receive the criticism so I can change. Of course, I expect that this is perfect. He's not going to, criticize. Whenever you finish your first draft, you believe you are going to get A or even A plus, because your paper is perfect. Your professor is not going to attack you. You believe that, but when you receive the paper, a lot of lines that oh yes, what do you think about this? I don't think it is clear. You know that drill. And so when I received that feedback from my husband, first of all he said, you should not publish this book. That's the first sentence. And he told me, this is really boring. You are not going to teach anybody. No one is going to read this. There is nothing new. Everything is researched by other people. People are already said these things. Why do you have to publish another book? Do not waste the paper. But, and he said, but these are the concepts that you should give more, energy to. These are the concepts that I think no one said that before. So why don't you give different perspective, like upside down, everything, but rewrite this whole thing with this perspective, which is third otherness. So the third otherness was actually defined in the end of the chapter. And he suggests, no, that is your perspective. This is what is so distinctive about your book from other books. Because this is the one that you have to bring to the world to recognize that how Asian Americans or Asian immigrants are in this third otherness space. So I have to rewrite the whole book again, of course, thanks to my husband. But when I start to look at my whole structure of binary between the black and white or black and non-black binary, and then also native and alien binary, third otherness plays perfectly in that area. And I realized, oh, that's why I couldn't stand myself and see myself in this binary. And I thought it's always my problem. My invisibility is always my personal problem, that I did not perform well, and I'm not good enough to be visible in any spaces. But this analysis gave me the meaning of existence in this world, that first of all, it's not my fault. That's really important for me to see that. It's structurally already fixed. But on the other hand, I also thought, yes, that is the place that I can reach out and change the world. Third otherness is not just the otherness, it is the transformationing space that give me the strength to reach out to many others and exercise my inclusivity in practice, in action. So that's how I actually defined my book. And I promised Zachary that I will not take no more than 10 minutes. So I will stop now. And I want to maybe ask you, what is your reflection or what you heard? Just to, not everybody have a chance right now, but only maybe 2 or 3 people, so we can have some time, and then maybe we can have some snacks after all.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I'm curious, you've written a kind of a trilogy, Post-Colonial Self,
Yes.
Post-Colonial Leadership, and Post-Colonial Relationship. Can you give us a little bit sense of your journey of doing that kind of work?
Okay, thank you. My first book was Korean Women and God in a actually multicultural and colonial context. So I studied my academic journey from the colonial context and how I was raised, and also understand the colonialism in Korean context. But when I moved to the US, my whole identity was shaken, because I thought I was the center of the whole universe. Not even the earth, the whole universe. But when I moved to the US, I realized that I am so invisible. No one recognizes me. They don't even know that I'm a Korean. They are keep calling me I'm Asian. And I thought, I never thought I was an Asian before, but suddenly I am in this country. So I was so curious about the immigrant identity, how I transform or change my identity from Korea to the US, what's happening to me. So that was very personal, and I start the journey. And then I give the more concentration on uri, which means we. And uri is very tricky, the word. And it was from the mistake that I made. One of my friend asked me, so, are you married? And I said, yes, our husband is in Korea. And she just look at me, we don't share husband. I was in a big, huge shame. it was the first year in the first semester in the classroom, and she, smiled and just like, and as soon as I spoke, I realized, oh no, it's not our, it's something else. It is my. Wow, my. Because in Korea, it's perfectly fine. It's 우리 남편. It means our husband. But when I speak it in English, it has to change. It's mine. So that was why I keep thinking about this our in my head. And it never fixed completely. I'm thinking something in Korea in different language, and then in America, I have to change the entire shift. Why is that? So I have to invest my entire journey to understand what is 우리, our, we. What is the communal self that Koreans perform? So that is the first one, and then I changed the whole thing. Oh, 우리 is not just 우리, it is actually the communal self and influenced by colonial experience. So I have to start with the colonialism again, and then come back to this I as the other. I'm in this country as the other. I'm not I as the center. So it go back to I as the other. And then there is another layer, but I'm not alone here. There is a lot of 우리 here in Korean community and actually Korean immigrant church. So I see the Korean immigrant church as we as the other in this country. And then later, I developed a post-colonial self, which is I and we with others. So it is much more like an intentional move. It's not naturally just to happen. This post-colonial self is intentionally you have to nurture and also develop. So that is the journey. And then I realized, okay, now I know who I am in this country through the post-colonial self, the book. Then I look at the society. Where is Asian leaders? Why they are invisible? Where I can find them? And then I start to do the post-colonial leadership. I want to know why they are invisible in this society. What is the problem that they have? That was my first thought. But as I do all the researches and I realize that it is not their problem, it is our problem in this society. So I bring the whole our problem. This time it's not Koreans' problem. It's not Asians' problem. This is the whole society that make Asian leaders invisible. And also Asians themselves have a lot of their own struggles. So I kind of analyze those one. And then after that, but I cannot stay only there. Where is the relationship that the Asian immigrants need to culture? So from the Korean to make my identity to the Asian is very difficult. But I know I have to grow more. So that was another goal. And yes, I am still see myself as a Korean, but at the same time it's a Korean American, but at the same time it's Asian American. Yeah. And how can I play with all of this at the same time? But my body and my identity is all of that. It's not one or the other. It's not only the both. It's like all of them that I have to carry and perform and also exercise and practice. So that was, yes, some of them said that theology is your own journey and your own experience. It's not only the biblical interpretations or constructive theologians' profound findings. It all starts from you, individual person, to reflect God and the Word. Yeah, so that was my journey to finish the trilogy, and now I really want to move to some other projects. Thank you for the question. That is very profound question. not easy to answer with one sentence, but if I may to give you some glimpse of what I think about that, it's the first thing is that I always, as she said, like a curiosity. Why am I defined as the other all the time? How can I challenge that space? What if I occupy the all other place? Then who am I? Can I be the center if I get all of these other spaces and make it in the middle? And so I claim, but why do I have to even come to the middle? I feel so comfortable when I go to the corner because I can actually lean into the wall and oh yeah, something that I can, lean into or against. Is that the space that I should start my journey? So that was, yes, out of my curiosity, the profound question is, who is the other? What is the other? What is the function of other? Who invented other? So I have to struggle with a lot of that otherness question. And that's why I invented this term. When I said that like a third other, the many native English speakers like, what? What did you say? Third what? Third other. Oh, there's no English word like that. And I thought, oh, that's great, because now I can be the creator of that word. So creativity is one thing that I thought the people who actually grew or the born and raised in the marginalized place, because we have a very distinctive and very creative views to see the world differently. So now I see the marginality as a little bit different space to envision myself. And the third otherness is the space that I want to exercise inclusivity and also the solidarity.
I'm going to add something real quickly to that, and I come from this as a perspective. I'll just talk about race and gender in this context, but we haven't talked much about gender binaries, but obviously those are very salient too. And as someone who does, as ascribed to me by the society, fit within the binary, right? White, straight woman. Part of the process for me has become a process of divestment from the binary, right? Detaching or divesting myself of the binary, even though it has afforded me certain privileges. And part of that work is also seeing how some of the things that, in terms of my, personal, spiritual journey, some of the things that crop up as obstacles, sources of anxiety, sources of suffering are actually products of the binary with which I've become invested. And I don't see how it is harming me. And so part of the divestment really has been, part of the problem here is this race and gender binary that has structured my life, and I haven't questioned it. The suffering it causes me has been rendered invisible, right? But as I interrogate it and I divest myself of it, that's where things and that's why I talked about the moral, because it holds moral standards up to me that I cannot, that as a human, as a complex human, I cannot adhere to at the end of the day, right? So that's, coming from it from that perspective, I think that I keep coming back to the word just divest. For me, that has been the work, divest myself of those structures, right? Because at the end of the day, I'm white because society ascribes whiteness to me. But even in that, it is a construction that I can choose how to situate myself against to some extent. So, yeah.
Oh, we have one more question?
Yeah. I actually have a presentation here. The deans want to express our appreciation for your dance and your concert of knowledge and writing and teaching and contribution to this community.
Wow. And so
invite
on.
everyone to stay, have some refreshments, and all remaining questions, you are welcome to speak and interact and mingle with each other, as well as the panelists
Thank you.